very much for coming along this afternoon to this really lovely venue that I think I was first in when I was working on the energy review of 2001-2002 for Tony Blair's government, if any of you can remember who he was. So anyway, I'm Rob Gross. I'm the director of UKERC. I'm not speaking this afternoon, and my role is really just to introduce everybody, welcome you all, and thank the team that have put the review of energy policy together before I hand over to Joanne Wade, who's our advisory board chair. But before I do that, just a couple of words around the report itself and the reception that it's got, because we have got some media pickup for the report in a number of regional outlets and in the Telegraph, and we've drawn a fairly stinging reaction from DESNZ to the effect that we ignored the progress that's been made towards net zero on many fronts, including in particular, of course, progress with renewables, and we didn't do that, and we always intend to be even-handed, and so I just wanted to make that clear at the outset. We are completely unfettered by needing to say what the government of the day might like, but we do try and be fair, and we are extremely clear that great progress has indeed been made on many fronts, despite the kind of increasing contestation of recent weeks and months, which I'm sure we will be discussing this afternoon. So there's a long list of authors that you can see if you find a copy of the report. I'm not going to try and read them all out, but I do want to thank them all. And I also want to thank the staff that work in our secretariat at UKERC, and in particular Jessica Bays, who organised much of the production of the report, wrote sections of it, organised the event this afternoon, didn't write said press release, so she can't be held responsible for that, and is lurking at the back near the Christmas tree, and is feeling a bit poorly, so we'll be off, I think, a bit early this afternoon. So thank you very much, Jessica. Thank you to everybody involved. We're running through until I think about 5:30. Please make sure your phones are silenced if they're not before. The loos are a long way away at the bottom of 2 flights of stairs. We're not expecting any fire alarms. If one goes off, it's clearly signed, and make your way out. I think it's back the way we came in. I'll hand over to Joanne. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Rob. Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's lovely to see you all here this afternoon. UKERC is launching its 2023 review of energy policy at what is, to put it mildly, an interesting time for energy policy making. Yesterday's final agreement at COP28, for the first time, urges countries to embark on a de facto phase out of fossil fuels, which is a significant step in the right direction. But of course, it doesn't require them to do this. So we're going to have to wait and see what the actual impact is. The economic crisis, caused by the after effects of the pandemic and the war in Ukraine, continues to limit governments' ability and/or willingness to invest in the global infrastructure changes that we urgently need if we're going to ensure that we transition to net zero in time and at the same time give fair access to energy services for everybody. And here in the UK, we've got the added disruption of, sooner or later, a general election. And we've already seen how this can stall or even sometimes reverse some of the progress in the transformation of our energy system. So, where are we as we prepare to step into the headwinds of 2024? I think, as you will hear from our speakers this afternoon, that despite the, yes, significant progress that we have already made in decarbonisation, we are at the moment off track. And if we don't have an immediate step change in implementation, the UK is likely to miss its 2030 target and remain off track for net zero. So there's a pressing need for the next government, whoever it may be, to arrive in Westminster ready to address that gap. And this report, this review, contains a lot of suggestions of how that can be done. I think it's worth just recapping the review's most urgent recommendations. And they include looking beyond the security of gas supply to how to manage reducing gas demand, unlocking the power of local energy to make sure that we can fully capture the value, both for the energy system and for the UK as a whole. Rapid investment in electricity networks, facilitated by significant change in the planning system and also in the way we regulate networks. Prioritising bold, well-articulated policy around heating, including paying much more attention to reducing energy demand. Thinking beyond electric vehicles, with a renewed push for public, active and shared transport. Broadening the scope of industrial decarbonisation to include dispersed sites and access to affordable electricity. And linking environmental protection and energy generation so that we can fully explore both the tensions and trade-offs, but also the co-benefits that link the two of them. So there is a lot to be done. And what I hope this afternoon's discussions will do will not only be a call for much greater action, but also a well of ideas for how we can actually achieve what we need to do. So this afternoon, we're going to hear from two of the report's authors. First of all, Mike Bradshaw, Professor of Global Energy at the Warwick Business School, will talk about the need to look beyond security of gas supply. And then Jan Webb, Professor of Sociology of Organisations at the University of Edinburgh, will discuss how we need to unlock the power of local energy. After these speakers, I will invite our panellists to the stage to give us their thoughts. And we've got with us this afternoon Vivian Geard, Assistant Director in EY's Economic Advisory Team, Dr. David Joffe, Head of Net Zero at the Climate Change Committee, and Dr. Doug Parr, Chief Scientist and Policy Director at Greenpeace. And when those three eminent commentators have given us their views, I'm going to invite Mike and Jan to join us back on stage, and then it will be over to you guys for questions and more discussion. So, without further ado, let me invite Mike up here. Oh, okay. Rob forgot to mention, this is on the record, it's being recorded, so don't say anything that you don't want people outside the room to hear. Thank you. Mike.
It's become somewhat of a sort of an annual event to have something in the review that deals with gas and gas security. But of course, if you think back over the last 18 months, the context within which we're carrying out that discussion has been really quite dramatic. And I want to say a bit about gas security and what has happened of late and what's likely to happen going forward, and then talk a bit more about this whole issue of managing falling gas demand. So it's moved on here, but it's not moved on there. Okay, right. Don't press the clicker. Okay, I've got it now. Fine. Solve that challenge. Okay, so what I want to suggest is that we've avoided a security of supply crisis, but not an affordability crisis. And if you think that the government is defining energy security as secure and affordable access to energy services, and the graph should be familiar to anyone who's been watching what's been happening, and most of you will probably be having a gas bill that reflects what's been happening, and certainly an electricity bill, that we have been over the last 18 months through a very dramatic crisis. And the crisis has been prompted by the actions of Russia invading Ukraine and the reaction of Europe to that. It's worth saying that to date, still it is the case that there are no European Union sanctions on Russian gas. It's really the actions of the Russian government in changing the business model behind that pipeline gas that's resulted in a significant drop. And we are still receiving Russian LNG, although the Commission is moving on allowing member states to adopt their own views on Russian LNG. But needless to say, we've been through this very dramatic price crisis. And the reason that this has happened is because of this 80% drop in pipeline gas flows into Europe, which has prompted Europe to pivot away to the global LNG market to secure the gas that it needs. And the global LNG market at this point in time is relatively tight. There's not a lot of additional supply out there that we rely on to fill the gap unless we're prepared to pay a high price for it. So looking back over last winter, there were a whole set of factors that meant actually we got away with it. We did not have a security of supply, a physical security of supply crisis. And the energy infrastructure in this country worked very well. And again, if you reflect on the fact that the government and Ofgem in their statutory report on gas security always point out that we've got enough pipes, terminals, whatever, and we've got a diversity of sources of supply to guarantee a secure delivery of the gas that we need. And that is true. And it remains to be the case. But of course, what they also say is we are dependent on price signals, and that has been the issue. But it's not really in the government's gift to do anything about those price signals. They are the price you have to pay to attract the gas that you need. And that's been the sort of sober experience that we've had of late. And the cost of doing that is reflected in the bar chart here, which is from the OBR, and it's looking at the cost of energy support policies, starting off with an estimate of over 72 billion, and it's settling on around a figure over 50 billion, to actually see consumers through last winter when they were cushioning them from the cost, the very high costs. Now, of course, prices have come down, and in fact, the November price for gas in Europe, as I speak, is 30% lower than it was at the beginning of the month. The price today is 30% lower than it was in November. Because demand is still low, we have a mild winter still, European storage is full. The question really is what happens next, because when this crisis started, it was described by many in the industry as a 3-winter crisis. It would take 3 winters before the global gas market was back in equilibrium, and we wouldn't have to worry about volatility and high prices. So we're halfway through, and we entered this winter with European storage pretty much full. The key issue is what happens between now and next spring and how much gas is left in storage as we move into next summer, because as last summer, we have to fill the storage up again, and that will require lots more LNG. So this is a set of graphs that come from an industry analysis that really tells this story in a quite straightforward manner, I hope. You can see the dramatic fall in Russian pipeline deliveries, understandably there in red, in green, and the response from the LNG market in terms of deliveries into the UK. And the blue line is the TTF, the Dutch benchmark price. So the LNG market has been setting the benchmark price in Europe. But if you look at the LNG industry, and those who work in or on the industry will know it's a very lumpy business building new LNG supply. It takes 5 years plus to physically build a new LNG terminal. So we know what's coming along in the near future. And when we look to the near future, we can see that there's a surge in new LNG production coming onto the market, principally as a result of expansion in Qatar and also in the United States. So the simple message here is that by 26 onwards, and how quickly it happens is uncertain because there are inevitably going to be delays. There's already a delay at one of the facilities in the US, Golden Pass. The market will have plentiful LNG, and there will be a switch back into a system of oversupply, and the futures curve for TTF that's there reflects that. So in a sense, the energy security affordability issue, which exposes us to global markets, is cyclical. And we're now moving, hopefully, we'll get through next winter, and then we'll be in a position maybe even of oversupply and low price. So I'm not being complacent, I'm just saying that actually the reality is, of course, it's not in the government's gift to influence what the global LNG price is. It never was. So that comes back to, on the demand side, what is going to happen with gas demand? Because one of the criticisms of what happened this time last year was insufficient explicit policy in the UK to reduce gas demand, compared to what was happening in Europe, where gas demand fell by 15%. Not all of that welcome, because a lot of it was demand destruction in industry, and that's not really recovered. But we have to ask the question, what does natural gas do in our energy system? You know, if like me, you're a bit of a gas geek, you'll have seen these diagrams and how they change over time. And I actually found one from 10 years ago in a UKERC presentation, and the figures in parentheses are what happened 10 years ago. So basically, we could say 3 things is what gas does for us, 3 things. Power generation, and increasingly, it's a source of flexibility to support renewables. We use it in heating, and I suspect the majority of us in the room use gas in central heating and also perhaps in cooking. And it's used in industry as an energy source, as a heat source, and also as a raw material, a feedstock. But of course, it's a major source of greenhouse gas emissions. So all of these things have to be replaced with low-carbon alternatives. And the pace at which we deal with these challenges, the electrification of heat, the decarbonisation of power generation, the decarbonisation of industry, impacts directly on how quickly gas demand falls. And that presents a different set of challenges, which we can call transition risk. Because as that gas demand falls, there are challenges to the existing infrastructure that supports the gas system. The pipelines, the terminals, the gas distribution networks. And that becomes a major source of insecurity if not managed correctly. So one way of thinking about this, and here I'm stealing shamelessly from National Grid and their future energy scenarios, I think as does everyone else, including the government, here we're illustrating what happens in a situation where we have a slower pace versus a faster pace. So leading the way is a net zero scenario, and you see a rapid fall in gas demand. Falling short, as the name suggests, is slower progress and we have higher gas demand. In the falling short scenario, physical security of supply, affordability remains an issue, particularly as demand is not falling as fast as domestic production, import dependency is going up. In leading the way, we are driving down gas demand. We have less gas to secure. So we're managing security issues through reducing demand, and we have a co-benefit because we're also decarbonising the system. So there's a huge amount of uncertainty over this. Interestingly, the government last week, DESNZ, published 2 reports on gas security, as promised in the Energy Security Plan. Well worth reading if you're interested in these areas, an excellent starting point. One of them looking at sources of the role of storage and flexibility, and the other looking at ways we measure. So just to sum up, because I'm just about to run out of time, this is a slide we produced back in 2014. And in 2014, we launched a project report from a UKERC flexible fund project called the UK's Global Gas Challenge. And our simple thesis was, because of the growing import dependence the UK was experiencing, we were now increasingly exposed to price volatility from the global LNG market, but also in a kind of rock and hard place situation between the global LNG market on the one hand and energy diplomacy between Europe and Russia on the other. And in that sense, there was growing vulnerability, and of course, look what's just happened. But it started with the security of supply and worked its way down. I would suggest that what we need to do now is to turn that on its head and start with security of demand. What are the factors that are going to drive down gas demand? How quickly is it going to happen? These are all issues which are covered in the report this year, and they're sort of the food and drink of UKERC. Because the question is, what does that mean to sustain the midstream? The national transmission system, the interconnectors, the LNG terminals. And what we need then is not a gas security plan, nice though it is to have it. What we need is a gas transition plan. And only if we have a gas transition plan can we actually manage an orderly phase out of natural gas consumption in the UK. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Mike. Well, I like the way that ended with we need to go, instead of going from the macro down, we need to go from the micro up, because that was very much a macro level view, and we'd now like to change the focus and talk from the bottom up and the value of the local energy system. So Jan, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Joanne, and thank you everyone for coming to listen to us and talk to us this afternoon. So for the last few years, last bout of UKERC, and indeed the phase before that, I've been involved in various kinds of research on the question of local and regional energy systems. And I just put that image on the first slide to take us away from the global world of gas trading down to the streets of the Wynford estate in Glasgow, which was refurbished about a decade ago completely. And that is part of what we need to think about when we're thinking about the local and regional scale. So what's the proposition here? Well, fundamentally, that if we are going to achieve our net zero targets in the UK, then we can do that more easily, more affordably, and indeed with more co-benefits if we produce a more decentralized energy system in the process. If we take advantage of the increasing amount of power generation that is connected to our distribution networks, our regional scale networks, if you like. And also, if we think about decarbonising our heating systems in buildings, as Mike has just been talking about declining demand for gas and a gas transition, there is that question that if we straightforwardly electrify the full heat load, then we are going to have to spend a huge amount reinforcing our transmission grids and generation capacity in order to meet the peak demand for heat, which is seasonal and which is only a small number of days of the year. So the cost of doing that is enormous relative to localizing the decarbonisation of heat, including thinking about the development of a third energy grid, the heat grid, heat networks of various kinds, can be very small as well as large scale. or larger, but certainly no larger than regional, I would say, even in our European neighbours. So the idea then is that by integrating heat, power and storage and transport at that local or regional scale, whatever that might come to, then we improve the whole system economics. We get whole system services and co-benefits to localities from using that distributed power and the residual heat that is given off by all of our industrial and economic and office-based activities, finding those waste heat sources and turning them into a valuable resource. That creates infrastructure efficiencies. It means we don't have to build huge capacity to be in the electricity system to be on standby for considerable parts of the year. We talk about those 4 Ds, probably very familiar to most people in this room, if not everyone. But one of them, perhaps, that we don't think so much about is that D about democratic participation in our energy systems and how do we engage people in the whole debate about climate change more effectively. Does that require a more democratized energy system or not? Jury's out on that one, I would say, but they're in the debate. I have to say that reading the UK policies that came out, UK government policies published in March this year, which the commentary in the review focuses on, there are references in those documents and in other recent UK government documents to a monetary value of up to 10 billion a year from using that potential from local and regional systems. So it's not that it's just researchers coming up with some fine ideas here. It is actually there firmly in government policy, but we need to be able to be in a position to capture that, obviously. So what is there out there? Well, you know, virtually 30% or 30 gigawatts of our electricity generation capacity, National Grid reckon that's about 29% of total capacity, is connected now to distribution networks. And one of those charts there just shows the gradual growth in that distributed generation connected into the networks since 2017, particularly in some ways surprisingly, I think, to solar capacity, but also to onshore wind, of course, and in terms of combined heat and power generation, which is typically gas, but could shift to other fuel sources potentially. So in those future energy scenarios, which Mike also referred to, the scenarios from 2023 talk about generation connected to the distribution networks continuing to grow, playing an increasingly important role through the 2020s, 2030s, and that they make this rather, I think, elusive reference to the growth of distributed generation, giving local areas greater choice, particularly around this question of local authorities. And of course, for social scientists, the question about local and regional energy systems is not simply about the technical needs of an energy system that runs on low carbon, is net zero in its functioning, but is also about the way societies work and what value to society comes from those systems and what does society want from its energy systems. And this is borrowing from Innovate UK's, actually was funded as part of the Prospering from the Energy Revolution Challenge. Innovate UK's piece of work with PwC, Otley Energy and the University of Leeds, which tried to model the value, some of the value of local energy systems beyond energy, and making that argument that they are about much more than energy. It's you know, more for less, if you like, so much for so little in a nutshell, that you invest less if you use a place-based approach, so there's money from investment is saved and put into other purposes, other uses. Energy savings are far greater, but the wider social benefits in terms of localities, jobs, welfare, cleaner air, better places to live are the biggest part of capturing that. So where are we now? Just looking, thinking, where did we start with this research 5 or actually more years ago? Where are we now? Well, I think in principle commitment, trying to be dispassionate about this and read those documents very dispassionately and objectively, and also doing the kind of case study work that we have done over the years with local and regional governments and their partnerships. In principle, yes, the commitment has moved on, moved forward, become firmer. But in practice, still a host of questions unanswered out there. Quotes, lots and lots of reports, lots and lots of writing about this, lots of discussion about it. A whole war and peace, said one local authority officer to me, on how it's achieved. And who needs local anyway? And what scale is local? And if it's local, who's going to do what? Local authorities are not fit for purpose, or maybe they are. Skidmore, of course, thought that they needed to be made fit for purpose by clarifying the government funding and resourcing arrangements around them. But in practice, what we still see is that supply-side emphasis very much empowering up Britain, and critiques from a number of directions of the fragmented, short-termist approach to developing local and regional systems where local government and local democracy would have a voice. So what's my to-do list for a new incoming government based on that and based on the research that we have been doing through UKERC 4? I would argue that there is value out there for the taking, for relatively limited amount of government work and government political capital to put those powers and resources for clean energy development back into our local governments. We're very unusual in Britain in not having greater municipal role in energy services, but we don't. So that we get that coordinated governance that the Climate Change Committee, among others, has been asking for, reducing those uncertainties, reducing costs that go with it, routinizing local energy planning, making it something that can be implemented, investing, of course, in our local government energy skills and expertise. We saw from ELENA funding from the European Union just the huge benefit that came from relatively small investments in local governments around Britain from ELENA funding in terms of further investment in local energy services. And then, of course, making sure that we remove the perverse incentives for funding low-carbon initiatives on the one hand and high-carbon developments on the other. You could argue that the bit that is critical in putting those policies in place is the regulatory piece that would allow those resources at local and regional systems scale to be combined, to be traded, to be visible, among other things, because they're not entirely visible. We don't know how much use formally we get from that 29% of generation capacity. So we are moving on there. Ofgem, interestingly, this year, its consultation on regulatory reforms, very much focused on moving along to a position where local energy is much more firmly embedded in the regulatory system. And I know I need to shut up, so I better not talk too much about this. But that is potentially offering us a route to making the best use of those locally integrated system resources. The longer term, just moving on to the end there, we do need to put heat networks into that picture of regulation, just so that we are not missing the potential to use all of that residual heat in order to offset peak demand for electricity. And we need that all to come together to make a better Britain, don't we? Thank you very much for listening.
Excellent. Thank you both very much. Thank you, Jan. Thank you, Mike. I'm now going to invite our panellists to come and join me on the stage. Just these three. Super. Vivian, I'm going to turn to you first, if that's okay, to give us your thoughts.
Yes, certainly. Can you hear me? I wasn't sure if my mic was on. Okay, I was too scared to say anything to anybody earlier in case my mic was on. I was caught saying something inappropriate. Added embarrassment that it'd be recorded as well. So, I should introduce myself. Well, as Rebecca already introduced me earlier, I'm Vivian Geard, currently working at EY, not been there for very long. Prior to EY, I did spend 20 years working in central government on energy, most of the time on energy and climate policy. So I own up and put my hand up to that right away, and that so hopefully should qualify some of the comments I'm going to make in a moment. My comments will partly be kind of reflections of working in central government or kind of policy development, but also a little bit of what I've seen and what I've learned actually since leaving the civil service. I have also got, my comments are kind of a range of disparate points, but hopefully they're kind of coherent and are interesting and spark food for thought and questions later on. So I wanted to start off by just talking about delivery, because delivery actually means so many different things to different people. We've had, the great big fanfare of the last few years of kind of government committing to a net zero target by 2050, and then we've had advice from the Climate Change Committee on how we get to net zero, and then a whole lot of work from government on whether or not to accept the Climate Change Committee's advice and what its own plan is for delivering net zero, and a whole raft of documents published in relation to that. So there we are, we're set, right, off we go. Well, no big surprise then when you actually do get to delivering on the ground, seeing real action happen. It's a bit like hitting the mud. It's a lot slower. Just getting through, getting through planning, getting through all the application processes for funding, getting to all the feasibility studies, getting to FID, that does take time. So, so no surprise that it just feels like, we've hit the mud and, we're making a much slower progress. The challenge for government, and governments particularly hooked on making announcements and policy announcements from kind of week to week, it does mean that their kind of announcement or kind of policy calendar it goes bare, it's empty. So there is a hunger, a need for more and more announcements, but there's less satisfaction from actually just focusing on real action that needs to happen and being patient, sticking to your guns and waiting, making sure that that investment happens, projects do come on stream, but all the time retaining that kind of connection between the strategic vision that you've set out and balancing that with the policy design and making sure you've aligned your incentives around the different policies you've designed, and it retains that link with the strategic vision. I wanted to actually give an example in this case. So just thinking about industrial clusters. So the last few years that I worked in central government, I did lead as the kind of senior economic advisor leading on industrial decarbonisation and then subsequently the hydrogen strategy. And so just around industrial decarbonisation, the kind of the biggest kind of change that has come out of government is focused on, selecting where. So first of all, deciding what are the key technologies you need to decarbonise, really hard to decarbonise sector like industry with their industrial processes. And then realising that your technology choices around kind of between hydrogen or carbon capture and storage actually require lots of infrastructure. And private sector, individual actors in the private sector, just are not going to be able to coordinate amongst themselves because there isn't an incentive strong enough for them to coordinate between themselves to deliver the infrastructure you need to connect the source of emissions to the transportation of your carbon and storage. So hence you've got these industrial clusters born. Inevitably, and this is where I'm kind of heading towards talking about place and location, inevitably, for government to actually do anything real on the ground there, government actually has to make a choice about where infrastructure's got to go. And so that obviously is not, it's not great for some people, for any businesses, not located close to where those initial clusters are, that's not brilliant, because your choices are not, you don't have much choice around what your decarbonisation options are, or you have to wait. You have to wait, hoping that post-2030, after government has kind of got its first 4 clusters up and running, that it then moves to the next cluster, or that the infrastructure that is built in those networks they're able to grow and broaden out, and you're able to then connect to those to access the hydrogen or electrification, hydrogen or carbon capture and storage networks. So of course, location and place become very, very important then, and there are choices that government is kind of having to make. My next point is sort of in terms of in relation to location and place is actually about this kind of argument about centralised versus decentralised energy, and I think it isn't. I mean, there are some trade-offs, but it isn't a case of deciding, well, which is the better route to go down. You need both. And we need connection between what happens locally with what happens centrally, nationally. If that, it's a whole energy. It is a system rather. And for the energy system to be whole, it needs to be coherent and connected and integrated. To me, that's obvious. The challenge actually is really about how you connect local to national. A lot of the civil servants, people kind of working in the FSO, ESO now, in Ofgem, they've been in the industry for a very, very long time, and that's fantastic. We benefit from their background and knowledge and skills, but unfortunately they come from a background where the system or the way in which things used to operate was, well, all we have to focus on is building the capacity and just supplying energy, sending it down the wires or the pipes to our customers, and customers will just accept. But the world has changed. So these individuals, whilst we benefit from their knowledge and their skills and capability, they actually need a change of mindset to realize what it really means when we talk about needing integrated energy systems. And having consumers on the demand side being a lot more active, have a lot more active engagement with the energy system, and in order to deliver some of the benefits that we talk about. Jan, you mentioned heat networks, and that kind of sparked a thought for me as well, because again, traditionally we've thought predominantly about gas or electricity. And we have separate markets for gas and electricity, but what we really need is a set of integrated market arrangements that takes account of all of the energy to recognise all of those benefits in an integrated, coordinated fashion. I might be going on too long, so sorry. Yeah. I haven't even got to some of the things I wanted to say. So I've talked about technology choices. I've talked about coordination. So technology choices. I did want to come on to this kind of debate in technology choices particularly between, so thinking about heat decarbonisation and the quite intense debate you see between electrification and hydrogen. Of course, there's a lot of vested interests in which way the country ends up going with heat decarbonisation, because there's huge demand out there for heating buildings. But fundamentally, government, this is my personal view, government should stop prevaricating. But government loves optionality and will retain options for as long as possible until actually pressed to make a final choice. Of course, at the moment, we're in a position where we've got an election that's going to happen, I suppose, in the next year or so. So we're actually not going to have any kind of big policy decisions or announcements made before that. I know this government's already set its stall saying it's not going to make a strategic decision on gas versus hydrogen until 2026. But in the meantime, you've got this intense debate between the interlocutors, the supporters of the different technologies continues. You've got kind of prevarication and delays of investment that could be happening. Because, again, in reality, we're going to need both. So we've only got, tens of thousands of heat pumps that have been rolled out. We need 600,000 of them by 2028. Why can't we just focus on getting those delivered, getting those into buildings?
Vivian, I'm going to have to ask you to wrap
I'm
up.
really sorry. You have to come to me afterwards for more.
I'm sure Vivian's got loads more to say, and we'll probably get to it in some of the questions. So thank you for that starter. David, I'm going to come to you next. I know you've got one slide. Do you want to just let me know when you want it, and I'll pop it up.
Yeah. Great. So my comments, I'm going to look through the lens of the 2030 UK target, the nationally determined contribution since COP has just finished. It did finish, right? Is it still going? I don't know. So I thought it was a good time to look through that lens and think about energy policy this decade. I mean, I would say this, but I think it's really important that the UK behaves in a way that honours its international commitments and so on, and it's committed to that 2030 target. So I want to talk about the challenges now, given that maybe progress has been a bit slower than it might have been so far. It doesn't mean we can't still meet the target, but what does that entail? And there has been progress. There's been progress in a lot of areas, even if we think maybe it should have been faster in some areas. We are gradually getting things like hydrogen, things like CCS gradually coming along, but they will be later than maybe some people hoped. We've made less progress, I know, not for this forum, but less progress on agriculture and land use and those sorts of things. So we are kind of behind, and we will have higher emissions in some areas than certainly our pathways, but also the government pathways had anticipated. So we're going to have to outperform those pathways in other areas if we want to meet that target. That feels particularly hard because it was, those pathways were pretty challenging in the first place. One area where there's a difference between what the CCC have published and what the government's published in terms of pathways to decarbonise is on the demand side. And so if you want to make up a shortfall in one area with extra policy, the demand side would appear to be something that you might want to look at there in terms of making up the gap. Would you mind, Joe, just bringing up my slide?
There
Lovely.
you go.
Okay, I can't actually see it, but I do have it on my tablet, so hopefully that will all work fine. Is that working? There we are. Great, so just to explain what this is, so every June the CCC does its annual progress report to Parliament on progress in decarbonising. So where it says June at the bottom here, that was our June assessment. Each of these columns, the top of the column for that sector is what would happen with it if we didn't have any policy to decarbonise. And the bottom is what the government is aiming for. That's the government's pathway. And what we've done is kind of rated the policies that get from one to the other as green, yellow, orange, or red. You can probably work out what's good and what's bad within that. And so we did that assessment in June, and then we did it again in October, because obviously in September the Prime Minister stood up and changed some key things about UK decarbonisation policy. But there were also a bunch of other things going on, right? There was the announcement for the steelworks at Port Talbot to be electrified. There were things in the ETS, and so on, a bunch of other things. The zero-emission vehicle mandate went through, I think, the week after the speech. So we assessed those things as a whole. The overall picture is actually not very different to what it was in June, but there's quite an interesting pattern there. Most notably, the buildings rating's got a lot worse. But actually, industry's got better because of the Port Talbot thing, where the government said it wanted to electrify industry, but had no policy and no mechanism there. So and so on. So I want to use that as a lens now to talk about, well, how could we meet the target? So in power, what you see is actually, there was quite high ambition already from the government to decarbonise on the right-hand side there. So actually going beyond what the government is aiming for is just not really feasible, right? That's like the limit of what you can realistically do. Actually delivering that would be a real success. Going beyond it, it's not going to help you catch up on the other things. Grid is obviously going to be really important there. Flexibility as well, because while we've been historically the last 5-10 years doing well on the renewables bit, we're behind on the flexibility bit of having a fully decarbonised system. On transport, the zero-emission vehicle mandate has limited the damage, I would say, that the Prime Minister's remarks might have done to the electric vehicle market. So the mandate requires that we'll have 80% of new cars being electric by 2030. It's not 100%, but 80% is still good. Can we push on towards 100%? Yes, I think we could, with supportive policy that helps us go beyond the mandate. And we're also going to need to have policy. If we want to retain some of the reduced demand in transport that we've had since the pandemic, we're probably going to need policy to try and retain that if we want to have that. On industry, I mean, what we've seen with the Port Talbot announcement, and more recently, not in these charts, in Scunthorpe as well, is that actually in industry, if you really want to decarbonise quickly and sign some deals, you probably can go quicker than the government's pathway. So that's an interesting area. We probably need, as a policy community, to focus more on the electrification option. It's interesting to see that in the UKERC review. We need a level playing field between hydrogen electrification, where we've kind of got a mechanism there for hydrogen, but it may bias things in favour of hydrogen, where electrification might actually be a better solution. But in a sense, we just kind of need to also get on and use proven solutions to reduce emissions. An area where, although the chart doesn't look very good, but there is potential actually to accelerate this decade, is buildings. So it's a bit of a mess. The Prime Minister announced a 20% exemption for households, even from a 2035 boiler phase out. But actually, if we want to, we can go quicker than the government has set out. It will require quite a different approach to buildings decarbonisation to what we've got. But actually, you can do it relatively quickly, right? Heat pumps are known technologies. We can also do heat networks, as we heard from Jan, and so on. We might need boiler scrappage, for example. We might need innovative things to think about there. And obviously, if we want to get off gas, as we heard from Mike, then we need to actually think, what can we do, not only to reduce emissions, but to reduce our reliance on gas. I won't go into huge amounts of detail on buildings policy, because we could be here sometime. So, I mean, to conclude, I think if we're serious about meeting the NDC, and it would be nice, we do need to up the pace of progress. In the progress report this year, CCC said that we need to make progress outside the electricity generation sector, which has been the one quick thing that we've been doing, at a rate 4 times what we've managed over the last 8 years, in the next 8 years, from 2022, which is where we had the data from, to reach the NDC. So that, a full-fold increase in progress is pretty serious and require some pretty serious policy commitment. To do that, we're probably going to need more of a contribution from the demand side than we've heard so far from the government, but also things that require engagement with the public, such as decarbonisation of buildings, which obviously we can't do without consent from the public and without their involvement. So all of the local area stuff that we heard from Jan is really important. But we also need to make the choices Vivian was talking about. We need to make choices rather than waiting for the perfect solution. We just need to get on, make some decisions, push forward with policy, and it may not be perfect, but it's better than just waiting and seeing and missing our targets, burning more gas, etc., etc. And yes, I think I'm going to stop there.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Thanks, David. Okay, Doug, over to you.
Right. Hello, everybody. My name is Doug Parr. I am the Policy Director for Greenpeace in the UK. So I've been sort of lurking around the climate debate for quite a number of years. And I thought, as a compliment to all the excellent presentations that we've had, I'd just say something pretty explicit about the political context in which we're working, in which we're campaigning, and in which basically we're all having to operate. Because we have entered a period of fairly intense debate about climate politics, one way or another. The trigger for this, I would say, was the by-election in Uxbridge, which was retained by the Conservative government, and they believed, probably correctly, that there was some significant backlash amongst voters about the ultra-low emission zone, and it was taken, actually by both parties, both main parties, to be backing off a little from their climate commitments. Now, I'm not going to argue about the sort of logical connection between all those, because actually it sort of doesn't exist. But the point is that it was a trigger, it was not the starting point. It was a trigger because there were groups in both main parties who did not think that their party should be as committed to climate change policy as they were. So in the Conservative Party, there's a bunch of people on the right who are fairly vocal, connected to climate skeptic elements in various think tanks and so on, who are fairly noisy about the need to back off from action on climate. And there are those in the Labour Party who are less visible and tend to be invisible, but are quite close to the centres of power, who think the electorate shouldn't be bothered with any of this nonsense, and we should just focus on public services and getting the health service in good nick. And so what we saw was if you like, a sort of backing away from these, which culminated in a speech that Rishi Sunak said, which was, in a sense, a break with the climate consensus about the need for action to deliver net zero. A break narratively rather more than substantively, I think. But nonetheless, a break narratively is important in the context, in the context where politics is very often all about narratives. And what we've seen following that is for the government to, which hadn't got a glorious record, as David was just outlining on its record on the demand side, dig in deep on the need for more supply as the answer to our energy woes. Now, might expose that as very weak in substance, but it nonetheless feels compelling. It's like, it's our gas, we've got it, it's our gas. Yeah, it doesn't work, but it felt compelling. And again, this is about the story. It's about the context in which we're all working. Now, it is going to be a dividing line at the upcoming general election. It's going to be a dividing line because Labour has got a commitment, which it has diluted, but it has a commitment to spend £28 billion per year on capital spend for climate-related purposes, its so-called Green Prosperity Plan. That's a substantial amount of money, and it's one of the only things that is actually in policy terms, dividing the two main parties. The Conservatives are anxious to paint that as irresponsible borrowing, and the Labour Party are anxious to paint this as a way that we can deal with our climate obligations, but more importantly, deliver jobs and prosperity as a consequence of green technologies coming through. Now, underpinning all this sort of surface noise, I think the thing to cling on to, well, let me say first thing, one thing that's worrying from a campaign point of view is that, and particularly looking at the way the Conservative Party is going, it's hard to imagine that for the rest of this decade at least, if there is any discontent about the delivery of policies that are connected with delivering our climate obligations, there isn't going to be a political party, small or large, looking to exploit that discontent in a political sense. And that could be either as a local level, because people don't like the pylons that National Grid want to build, or SSE or whatever, or it could be discontent about local charge points or changes to vehicle taxation or the perennial fuel tax issue. There will always be somebody looking to exploit discontent, which means that the next government, and it looks at the moment like it's going to be a Labour government, will be facing that populist challenge. Now, why I think that any party in government, or if it's a coalition or if it is Labour, should be able to stand up to that, is that when you look at the fundamentals of the politics, climate is still supported, climate action is still supported by a very large plurality of the public. Actually, a majority of the public are committed or think we should be committed to the goal of net zero. More than is represented within the current political debate. There is also very broad-based support for more government action. Climate and environment has consistently polled over the last couple of years in the top 3 or 4 issues that people think are facing the country. That's kind of YouGov data if you go up to it. Despite all the noise about immigration, until recently climate and environment was still polling ahead of that amongst the public at large. And there is no doubt that there continues to be, at the high level, continues to be support for the climate and energy transition. I would say, speaking to this group as well, that trusting science and scientists and academics to talk about climate change, that trust is higher in that group by a country mile than anybody else, including people like me. You know, people within the UKERC family are going to be far more trusted than anybody else when they speak about these things. And there is remains. I haven't got data on this, but I'm pretty confident there is a hunger out there for new evidence in relation to both the challenges and opportunities of the climate transition, and that can create. Well, I look back to my history actually when I was. When I was a young slip of a thing and I was campaigning on ozone depletion, and that was my background. You could tell that what was going on in the creation of the Montreal Protocol, which phased out ozone-depleting substances, was not that the science was there, although it was, but that the political forces that were unleashed by the evidence about ozone holes and about ozone-depleting chemicals and their responsibility for it was just something that the political system was really struggling to handle. So it wasn't the evidence on its own. It was the political forces that it drove that really made a difference. And it seems to me that people like you are in that space. I've probably got about a minute left, so I'm just going to quickly race. Yeah, you're nodding there. Quickly race through some things that I would say are kind of warnings about where climate policy risks are. One is on fairness and distribution of costs and benefits. That was driving concern about the ULEZ, and it will drive concern about other policies as well, however well-intentioned and however good the benefits are to the nation as a whole. I notice, and not just from the COP, but also from the UK context, that the industries that are going to be impacted negatively by all this are getting increasingly desperate, and it means that investment in public affairs and lobbying becomes an ever more cost-effective thing for them to do. There are some things that are potentially alienating in the way both of the main parties talk about how they're going to get stuff built. And we do need to build a lot of stuff. I mean, on the energy side, on housing. So both are, in one way or another, talking about ripping up red tape, bulldozing through new solutions. That is going to become very alienating, and we've got to be really careful about that. And in the review itself, I was pleased to see that, something looking at the broader relationship between building stuff and environmental opportunities and threats, that we are in a biodiversity crisis and a nature crisis as well as a climate crisis, and we do need to solve both of those at the same time on things like offshore wind and delivering the grid. And that's me done.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Thanks to all our panelists for some provocative thoughts. I'd now like to ask Mike and Jan to join us up here. And I'm going to turn it over to you guys in a minute, so have your questions ready. But before we do that, Mike and Jan, maybe Mike first. Is there anything you just heard then about the realities of implementation, about the scope for more action, and about the politics within which we are operating that you particularly want to comment on, respond to?
Not really, because I tend to agree with much of what I've heard, and I
Good.
just want to have more time to hear.
Excellent.
From the audience.
Jan, is there anything you want to?
Similarly, I think
Okay.
much to appreciate in all of the contributions, but perhaps...
Right, so while we're
Questions
violently agreeing with one another up
Yeah.
here, I'll turn to you
agreement,
guys.
yeah.
Okay, so Donald first, and then we've got a couple over this way, but...
Hi guys.
Yeah,
It's
you
on?
good? Yeah.
Thanks, Donald Brown from the University of Sussex and now Ashton Climate Solutions as of 6 days. So my question actually is directed at Michael in particular. Talk a lot about reducing gas demand, and I was thinking particularly about the gas network that we have in the UK. You know, we're using less gas than we used to, but clearly there comes a point where the utilisation of that system is no longer viable, the kind of death spiral effect, you know, as we hopefully bring more and more heat pumps onto the system. So is there a threshold, a percentage utilisation or something at which point that network is no longer really viable economically? And sort of what level or threshold is that? Is it 60%? Is it 20%? I know you probably don't have an answer, but is that a problem as I envisage it? And will we have to make a call at some stage for those homes remaining using natural gas that actually everybody's going to switch? So yeah, just thanks.
Thanks. Mike, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of front stage part of the whole transition risk package, is that if you think about it, yes, I think gas demand has fallen by almost 30% since 2000. In fact, the DESNZ report talks about a further 30% plus fall by 2030 using their own modelling, and again, a similar, if not more, through 2040. To the point, actually, by 2050, they're only seeing 10 BCMs of gas being consumed compared to 72 BCMs today. So the issue is, as we dial down gas consumption, how do we keep the infrastructure in the money? Because the people owning that infrastructure have to cover their costs. You know, in many instances, they're sunk costs. The infrastructure is paid for. It certainly presents challenges to investing anything substantial into the network going forward. And I guess the answer is usually in that sneaky term, hydrogen ready, is that certainly many of the gas distribution networks themselves are the principal proponents of hydrogen in domestic heat. You know, and I think, you know, the comments that David made and the sort of highlighting that there are already mapped out by the government critical junctures where decisions have to be made on hydrogen, on the future of the network, and so forth. And so those are not going to be easy decisions to make, but they are the key part, you know, they're the key elements of having a gas transition plan. As to what percentage, I suspect it's going to vary by the gas networks around the regions. I think the other issue really is how do you manage repurposing of networks, not just the gas distribution network, but elements of the NTS to support a hydrogen backbone, for example. So I don't have the answers. What I'm suggesting is we need to ask the questions and we need to think about it. And the government is probably being heavily lobbied, left, right, and centre as to what the answer is, because the incumbents have so much invested in trying to keep their infrastructure in the money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Vivian.
I'd like to add something to that, and just thinking about kind of pragmatically of where we get to, how we get from where we are today to a world where we have certainly on a kind of a holistic basis kind of identified what that threshold is, and therefore we've run down the network. The reality is so certainly the gas network operators today is they're about to enter the next investment round, the RIA round, and I'm not a RIA expert at all, but I certainly understand that they don't necessarily, they're finding it very difficult to decide on what their investment requirements are for maintaining the network. Because it's not just about investment in the network in general, it's actually knowing which pipes are going to be needed for what purpose. And if they make a call now, they may make the wrong call, or the regulator who is receiving and reviewing their business planning applications, they also need to be aware of some of these challenges as well. So when they are critiquing, rejecting or approving the investment requirements for these businesses, they're doing that in full knowledge of that kind of challenge and uncertainty about exactly what's needed to go where.
Jan, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I was just going to add that there is notionally in the current regulated price control period for gas and electricity networks, in Ofgem's guidance, there is notionally a mechanism that gives a route direction to some of this. It's called the Coordinated Adjustment Mechanism. And in principle, it asks that question about how do you decide in any particular area what the future of the gas and electricity network infrastructure should look like, and should funding through that regulation price control process be reallocated from one to the other. Now, I can imagine that is politically really difficult territory to be in, and I think the networks in their current business planning process had some, I suspect, some relatively light touch discussions about that coordinated adjustment mechanism. But it is in there, so there is a little pointer in that direction. And of course, I was also suggesting it needed to integrate a third grid, heat network grids, into that kind of price control, best value at an area basis comparison.
Thank you. We've got a couple of hands over here. I'm going to take those two together, one after the other, and then we'll answer those. So there were a couple of people put their hand up. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Spencer Marlowe. I'm just a general member of the public, educating myself on these things. So thank you, first of all, to UK ERC for opening these sessions to the public like myself. My question is generally, I mean, listening to everything you've been saying and everything you read about this, the whole transition to net zero still feels politically and socially like an incredibly fragile endeavour. You know, Doug made some very pertinent points about the narrative that's growing, and we saw this year about the sharp, almost U-turns that appear to be made on the road to net zero in response to, you know, the early perception for the public about cost and risk. My question to the panel is generally, aside from all the noise that we read, what is your honest perception and trust and faith that we can as a country find a cross-party consensus in the long term to see this journey through? Or is this journey always going to be hostage to short-termism, populism, one might almost say culture war, wedge issues? Is that the risk that we face, or is there an undercurrent of seriousness that's going to carry us through?
Thank you. Was there another question over that side? I thought there was a second hand up. Maybe not. Go on then, Kate. Yeah, I know there's a couple over here. I'll come over here in a minute.
Just a quick one. The Grangemouth announcement about the closing of the refinery, is that a policy success or a policy failure?
Okay, so Grangemouth, success or failure, and then broader question about can we develop the political consensus? Who would like to go first on either of those? Doug, go on.
Well, let me take the first one, and thank you for the question. Thank you for coming. I always think there are going to be frontiers of making things happen and making change happen where there are opportunities for exploitation by the populist, actually. And, you know, up until now, and that's why I'm so cross with Rishi Sunak for what he did, up until now, the UK's been lucky in that we don't look like other Anglophone nations. We don't look like the US, we don't look like Canada, we don't look like Australia and New Zealand, where there's this tremendous left-right divide about whether we should, you know, is it worth tackling climate change? But I'm long enough in the tooth to know when the front line of that battle was whether we should have wind farms or not. Well, that used to be where it was. You know, oh, they cost too much, they don't, yeah, they're totally unreliable. They'll never mount to anything serious. And that's changed. And there was a time, actually not that many years ago, when the idea of electric cars would have been left out of court. And that's changed. And now the front line of the battle is going to be about speed and scale. It's going to be about grids. It's going to be about, you know, getting into buildings. And at each point, you know, you have to find a way to make it work and then take it forward again. I think, you know, this is a journey nobody knows where, well, we hope we know where the sort of technical end point is, but I don't think there is not always a political route map. And we're very much navigating by the seat of the pants. And that's why, you know, much as I love to see the idea of a strong cross-party consensus with an overall plan about how it's going to happen, I sadly don't see that in the offing this decade, and probably not for a while. At each point, you know, you hope that as you move on, then there is reconfiguration, and now from being, you know, by elements of the right thinking that offshore wind was ridiculous, now want to claim it as a success. So, you know, you just have to force it forward, watch the politics reconfigure, and then go again. I don't know if that, and it doesn't really answer your question, but it just explains what I think is going on.
Was it on the politics as well then? Okay,
yeah,
you next, and then I'll come to you, Mike.
Come in a little bit. I mean, I think it's important to recognise that some of the political objections are going to be, ultimately, they're going to be economic, right? That some of this stuff is just too expensive or whatever. And it's important to recognise that because of the progress that Doug talked about in renewables and in electric vehicles, these things aren't going to cost us any extra money. So I think actually, you know, in terms of having a largely decarbonised electricity system, in terms of having a vehicle fleet that's largely electrified, those things are just going to happen because that's the direction the economics point. And of course, there may be some holdouts, and it may be difficult to get the last few bits of emissions out of the electricity supply. But broadly speaking, those things are doable, and we'll get at least most of the way. Whereas buildings, it's involved in people's lives. It's not cheap. I mean, obviously, you know, gas prices are expensive at the moment, so low carbon solutions look relatively cheaper. But broadly speaking, buildings decarbonisation is not cheap. We're going to have to be really careful with how we do that. And that kind of goes against what I said earlier about let's do it quickly. We're going to have to be really careful that we do it in a way that brings people with us. I do think we're at a moment politically where it's more possible to do that because of exactly the kind of things that Mike talked about in terms of the energy security dimension, getting off gas, imported gas, volatile prices and all of that thing, looking at the polling, you know, people care less about, or at least there's less broad support for action on climate change for its own sake, and more about both the energy independence dimension and the growth that we'll get from all of these investments. So I think we need to understand where the public's at and position it, but I do think it's possible to succeed there. There are always going to be some wedge issues. I don't think we can avoid that entirely.
Okay, thank you. Mike?
Yeah, it's probably worth reflecting a bit about what we've already achieved. I mean, we have power past coal, we've got rid of coal, you know, which many of our European neighbours have not, and actually have been stoking it up again. You know, so we have achieved in a relatively short period of time, you know, that rapid decarbonisation. We've done the easy bits, really. But that shouldn't be forgotten. And I think also what we are actually perhaps getting to the difficult things earlier than others. And gas is the next difficult thing for us because we're so reliant on gas. The only other analogy would be the Netherlands, and we do have a UKERC report on that, which you might want to read, looking at the Netherlands experience. So I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that things have moved very quickly. I think one of the other disappointments about this sort of reset, if you want to call it that U-turn, is the sort of the loss of international leadership, because we may have power past coal, but we're certainly not beyond oil and gas. You know, and it's very strange to see the UK government lauding the need to transition beyond fossil fuels, having a matter of weeks ago decided it was going to have annual rounds for exploration in the North Sea. But let's not worry about those things, I suppose. You know, when it comes to Grangemouth, I can't answer the question good or bad, but I would say I know for certain it's part of a much bigger debate about industry in Europe and the impact of decarbonisation. And that has actually been brought into focus by the impact of the energy crisis. And I mentioned briefly demand destruction, but in a sense that's been sort of a window on the future about how European industry will struggle if it with higher energy costs or higher costs of carbon. And certainly in Germany at the moment, that is really focusing minds. And that's part of the reason that they have a very ambitious hydrogen program, although they still will want to import 70% of their hydrogen. I just think it's a much bigger issue that is now got to be dealt with in this context of the impact of decarbonisation on the European economy and how that's going to be handled. But so I don't have an answer, but I think it's a very important issue that you raise.
Thank you. We've got a next question here in the middle. No, it's coming.
Yeah, thank you for a very interesting panel discussion. So I have a question, maybe more specifically for Jen. So it's about the integrated local energy systems that you have mentioned in your presentation. When it comes to local, we can have a community-based local energy hub, or we can have positive energy district, which is more of a popular concept in maybe mainland Europe, or we can have other kind of a sort of more in the neighbor kind of scale neighborhood. How do you foresee in your vision local integrated energy system for the UK would be like? On what kind of scale would it be? Mixed kind of a district, or would it be more like a city scale, postcode? How do you foresee that?
Yeah, okay, thank you. I think it could be a whole variety of those, depending. I mean, I'm very much of that view that Vivian also articulated, that this is about making our whole energy system more resilient, more resourceful, more flexible, and making part of that in the research that we've done suggests, and certainly lots of other work that backs that up, that by making the best use of all of the resources that are available locally, it makes the whole system more resilient, more effective, and more affordable, and that there are benefits to the localities. But what looks effective in Leeds might not be effective in downtown, I don't know, Aberdeenshire somewhere, or what. So it's what is fit for purpose in that locality, and that may sound like it's rather slow, but actually there are enormous amount of pilot studies, of local demonstrators, of pieces of work that are already there in place. There's a lot of local knowledge, if you like, in different parts of Britain around what could be done with a bit more resource and a bit more direction from policy, so that those pieces could come together. We've got all kinds of, lots of case studies in the work that we've done, all kinds of scales and opportunities and different consortia, different sorts of partnerships, from quite very sort of commercially oriented settlements to, in some areas, to very small scale community oriented wind farm developments in other areas, typically in more rural areas, for instance. But yeah, it's horses for courses element, I think.
Thank you. I've got a question just next to you there, and then another one in front. So maybe I can take these two together. So,
Marshall Hall from the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. The Energy Act has been passed. The FSO is going to be up and running by the middle of the year. We have the networks, major networks now, electricity and gas under separate ownership. Do you think this new legal and institutional arrangements are going to work? How is it going to work? Because it looks a much more complicated institutional setup than we've had previously. And do you think that the institutions collectively, Ofgem, the FSO, the asset owners, DESNES, other government institutions, the National Planning Commission, National Infrastructure Commission, do you think there is a chance that we're going to get a sustainable set of policies to allow us to approach something like least cost decarbonisation over, let's say, carbon budgets 6 and 7?
Great.
Let's restrict ourselves to there.
Thank you.
Right? Have we got it right?
Thank you. And if we can take the second question as well. Thank you.
Thanks. Chris Gentle from the World Energy Council. Actually, it follows on from that question, which was, Doug, you mentioned that the thing that's changed in 2023 is that energy transition has become politicised with ULEZ and what's happened with what Sunak has announced. Just following on from the FSO and the question there, I wondered if we should go further. If we take the Climate Change Committee as a kind of the OBR of basically regulation about basically challenging government. Do the panel think that we should go further, which is completely depoliticise this and move to something like a carbon bank, which is like the Bank of England, which has independence, setting interest rates in a way to depoliticise this, because otherwise it becomes a political football, and even though the law that's just been passed actually doesn't get past those issues. So I wonder if the panel think that we should go much further and create something like the Bank of England that has independence completely on this issue in order to actually kind of make progress on it.
Great. Well, thank you very much for having two questions that fit together beautifully. Who'd like to go first on have we got it right, or should we go further? Doug?
Okay, well, let me give some thoughts on that. So just on the creation of the FSO, of course it's good. What I would like to see is that the roles and responsibilities between DESN's, whatever we pronounce it, DESN's, FSO, Ofgem are actually made much clearer, because if I look at the Energy Act, and even if I speak to people engaged in it, there's still quite a bit of woolliness around the edges, or even not around the edges, in who exactly does what, and I think there's still a bit of feeling the way a bit with that. Now, there's the agreement to the for all the recommendations of the Windsor review means that they're sort of, I think they're going to kind of operationalize it and see how it goes. And I'm not necessarily saying that's a bad way to go about it, as long as they come up with a good outcome in terms of the strategic plan, strategic spatial plan. But there is some way to go, and there's even some further integration that's needed in terms of thinking, in terms of what goes on offshore, because that set of institutions doesn't do it yet. So we need even more there. In terms of going further, I mean, it would be nice to recreate a kind of, depoliticized space. I just can't see that would ever happen now. And there is a democratic argument that says it shouldn't. That we're going to be spending shed loads of public money on this. And yes, of course, there may well be returns to the economy all over the place. But almost by their nature, if you're spending taxpayers' money, then there should be some accountability for doing so. And I am very much in favour of strengthening the role of the OBR in its role on climate change, because it actually does quite a lot under the radar, which most people aren't aware of. I certainly wasn't aware of it until a few months ago, just how much they do on climate and what government should be doing in the fiscal position. So I'd very much strengthen that and higher visibility for it, so that in essence it acts as an accountability mechanism for government decisions on finance and spending, and whether they're actually up to the job of the sort of scenarios we need to go on. So there's that, and I think stronger accountability mechanisms are always got to be welcome. But I don't think you can, at its core, I think this is a political job, and it needs to have political input. So I don't think we can sort of extract it and put it somewhere else.
Anybody want to have David?
Yeah, I'll come in a little bit. I mean, particularly on the second question. I mean, I've been at the CCC since it started, about 16 years. In the early days, we did have some conversations with the Bank of England, for example, and understand how they operate and so on, and is there potential for some kind of equivalent? But there are just so many more policy levers that you have to pull if you want to get anywhere close to net zero, rather than a single lever in interest rates plus maybe some quantitative easing. So I think it is quite different. I agree with Doug. It's inherently political, and therefore having it out of political control probably is not appropriate, even if you thought that could be effective. But there are alternative mechanisms here where you place more emphasis within the political system. For example, you know, I've heard it floated that the Treasury should be in charge of allocating who gets to emit, you know, in terms of which departments get to have what size of, what share of the carbon budget. and they actually have responsibility for that alongside allocating the money. And obviously, if you don't get the money, you probably don't get the decarbonisation in that area. So, you know, some kind of mechanism that still has a political dimension, has a democratic dimension, but actually is more effective, may be something worth thinking about.
Thank you. Jan, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I was going to say that I think in principle, you know, and this is a long running saga in a lot of organisation studies, you can make most organisation or institutional structures work where there is a political will to make that happen and where there's enough direction and the sharing of the resources to make that work. So it depends, you know, have we got the right institutions? I don't think there's a single correct answer there. I would say that we could make the institutions we already have work, which I suppose is very much in line with what others are saying. I am interested in the proposals that come around the independent systems operator via Ofgem to create regional energy strategy planners, or strategic, I think they're calling them planners, which follow from that consultation about trying to engage the local and regional far more in deciding the direction of our future energy systems. It also responds to your question in a way, which is how do you decide what's fit for purpose at those different scales, and how do we do that to best effect without you know, introducing yet more causes to delay or procrastinate. That's the difficulty, I think, that, you know, but I think on the whole, if you look at our European comparator neighbours, we are rather undergoverned in Britain, and therefore I would be in favour of that more, I think you call it potentially complex or complicated system of institutions, but I think we need more of that to pull more voices in, but hopefully constructively.
Great, we're almost at time. We've got time for two more. There's a gentleman here, and then Rob, I'm going to give you the last one as well. Okay.
Okay, well, the simplest way to avoid having complicated organisations to supply energy is not to use it in the first place. So I would like to ask, what about education to fill up all this great lack of trained people for insulating houses and installing heat pumps? I know the government has this idea that we mustn't tell people what to do in their own homes because that's the nanny state, but I think we do need education, and where does that fit into all the organisations and ministries?
Okay, so that's skills development. Rob, do you want to ask yours, and then we'll deal with both of those together?
I can do. In the interest of time, I won't ask. I have a question about whether or not actually unbundling the ownership and operation and sales of energy services to customers is still a good idea, right? So that's my big question. And I'd also like to thank the gentleman who introduced himself as a member of the public for his very insightful question. And UKERC's looking forward to a new phase of funding, we hope, if our bid to receive such from our funding masters is successful. And I think this question of contestation or increasing levels of contestation is very, very germane. It's a very, very good one, something that we want to try and understand a great deal more. So I'll just leave that as a comment.
As a comment.
You can take my question about unbundling of the whole kind of liberalisation edifice as rhetorical, if you prefer.
Or one for over drinks later, maybe?
Sorry?
Or one for over drinks later?
One for the drinks.
Yeah, okay. So, final question then for you guys. It is around skills and getting our supply chains and our skilled workforce there to do what we want to do. Who would like to take that one?
I'll jump in.
Yeah, go for it, Vivian.
Because actually your question made me think about a few other aspects and challenges with deploying technologies like heat pumps in homes. So it's not just about having kind of the installers and the supply chain ready. There's also the quality and the kind of trust consumers need to have in these installers and having people enter their homes to doing things. There's been some consumer research that I'm aware of that has been done. And I think even if you have education programs or you around kind of developing skills, you've actually still got to get to consumers early enough. Because often, so at the moment with consumers, the majority of consumers who have gas boilers only really think about replacing their existing gas boiler when it breaks down. So that becomes a distress decision. They kind of need, and often that's kind of in the middle of winter, and they need it replaced straight away. They haven't got the time to go out and do their research about this new technology, heat pump. Oh, and I've got to find an installer. Oh, and I've got to let people come into my house and do all kinds of things like ripping out and replacing my existing radiators and possibly putting in some insulation. So part of the program around this is actually to get to raise consumer awareness, to start thinking about the insulation and heat provision of their homes before they get to the point where they're in this position of needing some kind of emergency. And that requires a wider skill set and capability around the supply chain too.
Thank you. Doug, did you want to add?
Well, yeah, I mean, of course we need more skills. We need more skills in a whole range of places, including insulation installation, including project management, retrofit, clean heating, heat pump installation. I mean, just to throw into that institutional discussion we just had, two things really. One is the Labour Party, which on current polling, you always have to say, if that doesn't change, will be forming the next government, wants a big new institution called GB Energy, and the boundaries of what that will do and not do are still extremely fuzzy, I think we have to say, and it may include meddling in some bits of the energy system which we touched on earlier, but it may also mean meddling in supply chains for the UK. But on the broader piece about retrofit, we argue for something, an organisation which we call the Warm Homes Agency. Narrative is everything. But the reason for that is that there are a whole range of challenges which I don't think our civil service are skilled to deliver, which is around those things like supply chain, training, I hate the phrase, but consumer journey, independent advice, quality assurance. I mean, let me put it this way. If you want to upgrade your home and it goes wrong, that's your problem. If the government insists you upgrade your home and it goes wrong, isn't that the government's problem? Or how much is it the government's problem? It's not clearly just a simple consumer matter. And we are going to be moving into that space, and therefore we need something else that can look after kind of liability, quality assurance, redress when things go wrong, and as well as some of these other things like education, supply chain skills. And I just don't think that's the civil service skill set.
Okay, super. Final comment, Jan.
Just on the heating buildings and insulation and retrofit question, there has been a long-standing experiment in the country where I live called Scotland, which seems still to be very unknown in England. Now, on the one hand, we do have effectively a warm homes agency, at least in a shadow form at the moment. It's called Heat and Energy Efficiency Scotland, and it is still inside government at present. But the intention is to make that an independent agency at arm's length from government. And every local authority, by the end of this calendar year, has to produce what's now called a local heat and energy efficiency strategy, which is intended, at least in principle, to be a comprehensive plan for decarbonising the entire building stock, according to that building stock and its challenges and opportunities, shall we say, locally. Now, I think the whole development of that heat in buildings strategy and the heat in buildings bill, which is now up for consultation, has been a long time in the formation, and it does show the huge challenges in doing this. But I would also say that on the UK side, the Green Home Grants Scheme local authority delivery version, which was independently evaluated, shows that when you work, when those kind of schemes are led at that local authority kind of scale, there is far more acceptance, trust, etc. But the industry side, and interesting opinions from the industry, would not invest in developing skills and taking on more of the workforce because the whole pattern of funding was far too fragmented and uncertain and stop-start. And so that was working, that government strategy for funding these initiatives was working against the build-up of the skills that we certainly need.
Yeah. Super. We're going to have to stop there. I'm sure we could carry on for a lot longer, but it is time for drinks, and let's carry on chatting over those. So could you please join me in thanking our speakers and our panellists this afternoon?